Sales and marketing for the city of Taj. On to welcome everyone to this evening of Authors Afternoon. We have a distinguished guest today, Ms. Makarand Paranjape, in conversation with Harsh Madhusudan. Now, before we get to this, would just like to tell you a little bit about the foundation. This foundation was established in 1980 by late Dr. Prabhakar. All of you know it does a lot of work in the field of literature. So let me just read this out from here. It showcases talented musicians, dancers, performing artists through praiseworthy literary and cultural initiatives. The foundation has an active presence in more than 40 cities in India and overseas. The foundation enjoys the patronage of Sri Cement Limited. It is ably assisted by distinguished associates, partners, and SR Women of India in its effort to create culture in the cultural capital of India. Now a little bit about the two speakers. Mr. Paranjape has been a professor of English at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi for over 22 years. He also served as a director at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. He is the author and editor of over 40 books and hundreds of academic papers. He is also a poet, novelist, columnist, and a public intellectual. Mr. Paranjape's latest books include JNU, Nationalism and India's Uncivil War, Identity's Last Seek, and Swami Vivekananda, Hinduism, India's Road to Modernity. In conversation, he would be with Mr. Madhusudan. He is an India-based public markets investor. He has written extensively on economic, finance, and politics for Mint, Swarajya, the Wall Street Journal, the Indian Express, and other publications. He has also co-authored two books, the latest one being A New Idea of India, Individual Rights in a Civilized State. Hope I got that.
Civilization
State, okay. So I'll leave it to you, please carry on.
A very good evening to all of you. It's my honor to discuss today with I call him Makarand ji or Dr. Paranjape, but just for today's conversation, to make him feel less uncomfortable, I call him Makarand with his permission. So Makarand, welcome to Kolkata, my hometown. In this book, and I was reading it first on Kindle and then of course, thanks to the organizers in print as well, you call yourself a reluctant public intellectual at one of the places. And I like that as a good peg to please first tell us about your life journey, which is very long, in brief, before we get to the book in general, because I think it is such a fascinating journey and it's very difficult to pigeonhole you in any particular ism, if I'm not wrong. And I find that very fascinating. But before we come to the journey, I really want to understand why we call yourself a reluctant public intellectual.
Thank you so much, Harsh, and thank you, Prabhakar Foundation. Thank you all for coming here this afternoon. Thank you to Taj Bengal. This is a great city of writers, poets, intellectuals. So it is the city of Bankim and Ravi Thakur and of Vivekananda and of Sri Aurobindo, who was incarcerated in Alipur jail just across over there. So it's a great honor for me to be here. In this great city, which was also the beginnings of India's modernity, as well as of India's decolonization. So all these things put together make this a very special afternoon for me, and thank you all for taking the time out. So I call myself a reluctant public intellectual because I didn't want to get involved in the JNU fracas, but it sort of was thrust upon me because nobody else was speaking up. But that is not to say that I'm a reluctant intellectual. I think the life of the mind, and the curiosity to understand things has been with me forever, as well as actually the vocation of being a writer, though you don't accept it because you don't trust it for decades. You don't think you have it in you because the benchmarks are so high. So I started writing when I was about 15, and then, since you wanted to ask me about my own journey, there was a sort of very interesting but decisive turn when I was about 16, 17. I was studying physics, chemistry, math. My elder brother was already at an IIT Bombay. And it was assumed that, and my dad was an engineer, so the path ahead, the trajectory was assumed. But one fine day, I had with another bunch of our classmates, some teachers were saying that those who want to prepare for IIT, we are going to help you. And it just took me that one afternoon when I realized I didn't want to spend my time, the rest of my life actually doing that. And I wrote to my mom saying that, I'm not interested in this, I want to pursue literature. And she had a meltdown, So she said, oh, we are a middle class family, what did you think? We're not going to open a shop for you if you fail. So she sort of referred me to one of her own teachers, who was a famous professor of English. His name is Professor M.K. Nayak. He was a Fulbrighter. He's no more. And at that time, he was a professor of English at the university, it's called Karnataka University, Dharwad. So this was a very interesting kind of turn of events, because I wrote to him and he wrote back. He wrote me a postcard and he said, well, you better make up your mind. If you pursue literature, either you have to go all the way to a PhD, or after your BA, be ready to sell detergent from door to door. He had a great sense of humor, and it nearly so happened that I ended up being a management trainee after my BA at St. Stephen's. But then I got admission to, I went to the US, to the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. I did my master's there, and again, I didn't want to do academics. I wanted to do something else. And one more little anecdote. So I went across two buildings. This is South Wright Street, if you know that town of Champaign-Urbana. And the English building, it was an old gymnasium. And I went over to another building where they had, political science. And one of the great South Asianists, Stephen Cohen, who then went to Brookings Foundation, but he trained and he had the security and studies unit. He was heavily funded by Ford. I went and talked to him, and he was very keen to bring me over. But interestingly, so he said, why do you want to switch? So I said, I want to go back and serve my country. I want to enter public life, talking about public intellectuals. He said, for that, you don't need a PhD in political studies. You need to be a thug or have a political godfather. I went right back to the English department. So what I'm simply saying is that despite various kinds of reluctance, I think, a life of ideas, a life of writing, and ultimately also this public part of it, that you have to put yourself out there, was meant to be, was I think, in a way, definitely meant to be, and it was just a matter of its unfolding. And now, as you said, these are a set of tires that have been retreaded a lot and have been all over. I see the pattern because, as I said, one follows in the footsteps, in a way, of the great people I mentioned. And then you see how much they wrote, people like Pankaj and, Tagore and Vivekananda, who lived only to be 40. He died before he reached 40. And Sri Aurobindo. So I think that concern with everything, because it's not just with one little thing. It's with the whole of humanity and society, which and nothing is excluded from that quest. Is the original quest, I think, of the Indian Renaissance people. That was my point. So one sees oneself very humbly, as it were, following in their wake.
And I'm reading it first on my Kindle, and now I was reading it here. And I found it very fascinating because we are meeting in this event when democracies across the world are facing, to put it very mildly, a lot of polarization. Right? There's a crisis of legitimacy. In the US, we just saw recently the Roe v. Wade decision being overturned by the Supreme Court. No matter which side of the arguments you are there, people are again talking about civil wars and so on and so forth. That might be an exaggeration, but in India also, last few years, we have seen a lot of things being settled on the streets, so to speak, rather than in the parliament. So, more broadly about democratic liberalism, there seems to be a crisis. I think the diagnosis is more or less, there is some consensus on it. But what are the underlying reasons for that? What do you see? And I mean, the JNU thing is very interesting because in 2016 something happened, we'll come to it. But more broadly first.
Exactly. I mean, I tend to see JNU as a kind of microcosm. But your question is very apposite because it's the anniversary of the emergency, which was the time when civil liberties were suspended. We were in a virtual dictatorship. The constitution was suspended. And even as we speak, there are riots in Mumbai where the Shiv Sainiks are attacking the so-called defectors or turncoats. So matters are being settled in the street, as it were. But I think that what is different about this challenge to democracy, I mean, democracy is very messy, as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said in an interview with, was it Vanity Fair, some years ago. Democracies are not easy. Democracies are messy, and the difference is that 100 years ago, if you went back to the 1920s, the world had, three major systems, that were there, and people had to choose. So, or maybe more than three. But what I'm trying to say is there was fascism, then there was communism, which was very attractive. The whole world was going the communist way, including our first prime minister, the Fabian socialist, Nehru, and then his daughter, who tilted so precariously close to the Soviets that if you look at the Metrovkin archive, we were, I think, a compromised state quite a bit. So there was communism, there was fascism, which was defeated by the end of the Second World War. And there was imperialism, which was defeated, at least the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburgs, and, the Romanovs. That ended with the First World War. And then British imperialism itself unwound after the Second World War, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the fall of Singapore, it was momentous because the Japanese were on their last legs, but I think the British had lost their will to rule, it would seem. So if you look at 100 years ago, and then there was democracy. And in a way, it seems as if democracy triumphed against so many odds. But today, it's not as if there are more attractive options outside. Though some people make that claim that authoritarian regimes, look at the way they handle the pandemic. China is showing itself as a so-called stable alternative to the US. We are at the beginning of another Cold War, most likely. And what's happening in Ukraine seems to be a diversion from the real tussle, of hyperpowers, which is about to unfold or has already unfolded. And we're dealing with another kind of threat, digital colonization, where people lose their autonomy because of weaponized information, algorithms are taking away your freedom. So I'm saying democracies are threatened from inside now, more than outside. And the big threat, as I've shown in my book, is a fractured polity and a divided society, completely polarized, where those things which make democracy attractive, which is freedom and dissent and discussion and debate, these things are becoming harder and harder. Not because of external threats, but I think, as we were talking about it, we are on the brink of a new dark age because of wokeism, cancel culture. Everybody's afraid. You're afraid to give offense. You don't know who, as we speak, in this room is bristling against what you or I are saying or even thinking. I mean, with due respect. But this, I travel all over the world, and this is going. I mean, universities abroad. When I was in the US, there were hostages. American hostages were in Tehran, and there was a demonstration in favor of the Islamic Revolution. And I'm saying democracy means you can do that, even though your people are there. And now it's impossible. You can't say anything. So I think that, to finish the point, I think democracies are frayed now, afraid and frayed, if you like the turn of phrase. But because the alternatives to democracy are not really that attractive, frankly. I mean, nobody wants, if they're given a choice, to go and live in, say, China or Russia or even Turkey, So the threats to democracy from the outside, which is authoritarian regimes, a kind of revanchist single-party communist state, which is also very capitalist, Islamism, these are not attractive. But democracies are divided and threatened from inside. Like there's a canker that is eating at their vitals. And it would seem that free societies have lost confidence in themselves. Because the things that made them free, those very things are now being undermined. And in India, among all the different kinds of ills that we go through, we have this sort of extremely reinforced identity politics. So that I'm at a university and ideas are not important. The extent of your real or imagined deprivation becomes your claim to entitlement or preferment. And now the Honorable Supreme Court judge is speaking this language, trying to bring it to the private sector. So to me, it is these things that are the real threats to free societies. And it would seem that things are going to get worse before they get better, because COVID has brought the fault lines out. There's been so much isolation and though you don't want to use that term, mental illness, anxiety all over the world, that before I think the restoration of confidence and self-belief in free societies, I think we're going to go through this churn. And it's not only big democracies like India and the US, but bless it, for smaller ones. Look at UK. A prime minister has to go through a confidence vote for a party that he held. I mean, however reprehensible it might be. Is that an issue for a government to fall on? And everywhere. I have taught in Germany, for example, and younger people, they don't want to enter the job market. They want to be in universities as long as possible. 40% taxes, and you go to Brazil, and there's only 2 states that are productive, really speaking. Though you shouldn't be saying these things, but you go to Amazon as a state, and the whole state is subsidized. All the businesses close, Bahia, whereas it's Sao Paulo and it's Minas Gerais, which is full of minerals. So we've got this, instead of license quota permit Raj, we have this reservation subsidy, political correctness, identity politics Raj.
No, absolutely. I mean, just like self-doubt, self-flagellation is also a key feature of free societies. And I would say a necessary feature of free societies. So maybe what we are doing is part of the correction here. What I find very interesting is you mentioned wokeism. And you often mention, hermeneutics or interpretation of ideas or ideologies. And one of the things is with the term liberal or free societies or open societies, as Isaiah Berlin would write, or Karl Popper would write. It's one of the problems is in the last 50 years we've gone from a quote unquote liberalism, of John Rawls, which was about the individual. Even he had the famous kind of experiment where you were not supposed to know your identity, the whale experiment. To now wokeism, which is all about your identity, and that is also an ascriptive identity at birth. You mentioned that how much deprivation you have, real or imagined, at birth, as in your community's deprivation. You might actually be very privileged personally. And some of it is necessarily historical correction. But where do you think we suddenly kind of flipped, did a 180 on this kind of Rawlsian liberalism, however much you would agree or disagree, to this kind of new wokist liberalism? And I think after we answer that, that would be a good segue to JNU, because it's probably the microcosm of that thought process in India. But more globally, what happened to this? How did liberalism involute? And how did it turn on itself?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a very good question, and there are historical reasons. I don't know if anybody's seen this film called Red Joan. It talks about this, it's a very interesting film. It's about a British scientist who was spying for the Soviets. And the reason was they wanted to equalize. They thought that if both sides had nukes, then the world would be safer. But, I mean, many so-called liberals have been very wishy-washy. And what Francis Fukuyama has a new book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, where he, I mean, from the end of history to an honest self-appraisal of what's gone wrong. But I talk a lot about it. I think that a lot of the so-called liberals are actually illiberal. And they're really, I mean, they are bullies. And that's what cancel culture is all about. It's a very illiberal imposition of a very narrow set of sanctioned and extremely sanctimonious views on everyone else in the name of something that is supposedly good. I mean, whether it's equality, environmental justice, all these are very good causes. But in the name of these so-called good causes, you end up actually not only suppressing free speech, but the flow of ideas. Because actually, in my view, liberalism is based on a competition of ideas. In other words, good ideas, good practices should prevail. But now bad ideas and bad practices are being forced and I would say standardized, institutionalized across the world. So bad admission practices, the sort of exaltation of incompetence and mediocrity in the name of some virtue. So this is, for me, this is the end of true innovation. And what do they do? I mean, in the US, you have these pockets, right? Like you go to the valley, there's a different culture there. And that's also a different kind of excess, because the skewed distribution of capital is a matter of great concern, the inequality. In fact, COVID has brought this out. In India, we are going to be a very unequal society because the lower middle class jobs are being wiped out. Look at Agnipath or Agniveers. That's an example. People want to join the army for lifelong benefits and pension, and that's going to be contractual now. So, those who are already privileged, they are, they've got richer. In COVID, look at though people have suffered losses, but the richer by and large become richer. The entire capitalist class all over the world, their net worth has grown. And then there's a precarity in our societies, which is not nice. I mean, for people who are hungry to rise, there are no avenues. So we have to think about all these things. And to deal with them, the temptation is to impose bad practices, bad ideas, lumpenism, a kind of, you called it democracy being settled on the street, lawlessness, bullying. These are the kinds of things that are happening. And the same thing happens in the realm of ideas. So there is a so-called dominant, and then there's a sanctioned dissent. And if you differ from either, you've had it. So that's why I called it intermediate hermeneutics here, that you need a way to make sense of the world. I call it intermediate because ultimately it should be remedial. There should be a healing that actual hermeneutics produces. That by actual I mean good ideas, good practices, deep understanding, deep cognition actually produce healing. They produce positive energy. They should enable institutional reform. And in that sense, those things are not happening. And in India, we are going through an institutional crisis when it comes to higher education, state-funded. And the private sector is going to boom, but at present, a person without resources or with limited resources, which is one of the good things about JNU, that you could be from any background around, and your life could change. You pay 20 rupees in fees, and you could become an IAS officer. This was the JNU dream. At its best, it was a progressive university where a student studied and also, so to speak, became an agitationist. But as I've argued, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that whole model, because I think the dream of international socialism completely collapsed, as we know. So this model of education was in a sense, not only an anachronism, as I've argued in the book. It was not only stuck in a time warp, but it was really self-delusion. It was ideology, not as a system of thought, but ideology, as Marx would put it, as false consciousness. And I think illiberalism, wokeism, cancel culture, these are forms of false consciousness. And as a nation, as a free society, or even as a class of people who are privileged, I feel the purpose of an intellectual is to allow people to see the falsehood of the false, not to preach something else as a substitute. That is the critical mentality, I feel, that is required. But unfortunately, now I see the entire intellectual class lining up. It is a beleaguered, so-called left liberal, some want to call them a mafia, others call them the Khan Market gang. This book was also cancelled. I was with another publisher, an international publisher, and even the cover was done, proofs were read. It was about to go to the press, and I got a letter from the publisher saying, you know what, the times are not, propitious. We want to put it through one more legal, read. And I said, yeah, sure, because I was very sure of this book, because I was there, I experienced things, and everything is footnoted. There's nothing here which doesn't have a backup. And believe it or not, I got a letter with 183 edits, omissions, or revisions. So I said, let me talk to your legal team, and they were invisible. So I knew that they wanted to cancel this book. I went and talked to some lawyers, and they said, you might win, but your book will never be published because Indian judiciary, So I paid back the advance, I signed a non-disclosure, so I won't tell you the name of the publisher. So this is a fact. They will try to cancel you, and they will snag you. I've called it the Pancha Bakar, after the Pancha Makar. This is the land of tantras, so you know what the Pancha Makars are. They are the 5 N's that a tantric practitioner, under the supervision of a guru, had to do to break free of those constraints, socially imposed or otherwise, which were impediments to the freeing of his or her consciousness. But here, the Panchabakar, which I've outlined, the first is, they brand you. Okay, you're branded as a right wing, as a whatever these terms are, Sanghi, RSS, this, that, and the other. The next step is they try to brainwash you, then you're bullied and browbeaten, then you're boycotted. I'm still under a shadow ban in JNU. I have very few students, because of this constant propaganda, that I've had to face since 2016. And then the last, pardon the language, it's bullshit. That is, you just get snagged in some nonsense, open letters, defamation cases. So as a private individual, how are you going to fight all this? So you also get aligned. That was my point. Intellectuals get aligned. And now there's a new dispensation. So obviously the gravy train has shifted, and everyone wants to jump onto that bandwagon. And it has its own set of pitfalls. You can get promoted, or you could get benefited in some ways, but woe betide you if you step out of line. You can get defrocked, disenfranchised, the same control mechanisms, because regimes of power, they want to control. Control is the actual hallmark of how power operates. So intellectuals are getting divided and aligned to this side or that. And that's why the TV debates are not only cantankerous but cacophonous. It's rubbish. So this is the dumbing down of democracy, and if it's not a matter of social conscience or individual conscience, it's really something that we have to stand up to say, no, we will not be bamboozled and pushed into one camp or the other. We will exercise, our responsibility, because actually we are privileged. We are highly privileged. So if we don't stand up, who's going to stand up? And if we don't encourage our children to ask questions, I think that the future looks bleak to me, because, I'm always with young people and now they don't express views. They don't feel safe. The university is no longer a safe space, it would seem, to express what you feel, because you're afraid you'll give offense. And societies that I think some of us should be mindful of.
So, just for the audience, both here as well as people who might see a recording later, let's quickly recount what actually happened in 2016. So, in February of 2016, there were a few protests or poems and activism in protest of two terrorists who were punished, or in one case killed by the Indian state, hanged by the Indian state. They called it, in my view, falsely a judicial murder. And you were one of the few people on campus who raised their voice against these kind of protests. I mean, it was their free speech, it was your free speech. So I have a couple of questions there. And then, of course, you made a famous speech on 3rd March, which kind of went viral. There was a student leader on the other side, so to speak, and you kind of spoke out against him in your typical polite but firm manner. But before we go there, first of all, there are two aspects here. One, what about their free speech? You made a very interesting point about Iran-Contra protests in the US in the 80s. So are people allowed to protest even in defense of terrorists? I mean, there could be a Brandenburg standard of free speech. On the other hand, as you mentioned, you do your PhD here for 20 rupees, something. It's a subsidized state institution. So it's not just about your free speech, but about what you are being subsidized for in that institution. So in the French model of La Cité, for example, you can wear a lot of different kind of clothes, but you cannot on a state institution wear outwardly religious kind of clothing, for example. So first of all, where do you stand on their free speech? Do you think they should not have been allowed to speak because it is a state institution? And irrespective of that, what it is that you said for people's knowledge that became so viral? I think it's important that why was common sense so badly needed in that episode?
Yeah, first of all, common sense is very uncommon, okay? And that's not an original line, it's an old cliche. So, see, the point is that I'm completely against using British-era sedition and other laws to lock people up and shut people down. And I've written extensively even about how people are in jail for social media posts which don't threaten anyone. You just have to, supposedly some leader or their minions should feel offended, and there are so many sections of the Indian Penal Code. You can be locked up till kingdom come practically, and some of these activists are still languishing in jail. So I'm completely against all that. And by the way, I never said that some of these students could not, protest. It is not that. I said you can't shut down a university for 8 months. You can't hijack a university, turn it into a political platform against an elected government because you don't consider the ideology of the party which was elected to power to be legitimate. So how do you define false consciousness? You define it as something that's not falsifiable. So in a way, the communism that I saw in JNU, or whatever the leftism, it is not falsifiable because every piece of evidence that goes against it is not enough to wean people away from it. It's like faith. It's like blind belief. So my point was that 200 students couldn't hijack an entire university. People wanted to go to labs and classrooms. Some people tried to prevent me from going into my building. And I said, that's not the JNU culture. You're on strike, I'm not on strike, I'm a faculty member. How can you prevent me from going to my office? And I also said, you can't prevent a student who doesn't agree with you from going inside. So, and the culture in JNU became worse. On 5th of January 2020, there were some masked hoodlums, I call them. Some others say there were students from another group. They went on a rampage. They beat up people. First, the left-wing students, they cut the, internet and other, they went to the IT center so that people couldn't do online classes or register for the new semester. So none of this is democratic. So when I stood up against Kanhaiya Kumar, yes, we should name him because he's not the one who cannot be named, right? Not exactly. Then Voldemort was also named later. I mean, I feel a bit bad for him because, he came in, he had an opportunity to learn and he was in African studies. What does he know about African studies? He was a sponsored candidate in a center. We won't go into that, but both the Students' Union and the Faculty Union were in cahoots. They were both CPI, not CPIN, CPI, okay? And he joined the Congress Party. He was already meeting, the heir apparent of the first family. He was meeting them already, and when I had a conversation with a leading journalist, I said, you interviewed this gentleman as the new hope, the youth hope. So the match fixing is going on all the time. That was my point. And in JNU, the thing I said was that you started the protest against whatever these Kashmiri, they were separatists actually. It was a move. You don't believe in the constitution. They're calling it a judicial murder because these students were from a breakaway faction of People's War, whose manifesto is an armed overthrow of an elected government. And they split from that group because they said they were denied their right to dissent. Can you see the ironies? So I was merely pointing out some of these things, but I would never say you can't protest. I would only say that how can you call this a judicial murder when you don't protest when there's a genocide happening in Kashmir? And it's even now it's happening. It's happening in Afghanistan. So you talked about liberalism. One of the terrible failings of the liberals is to call out Islamism. You can't speak out against it. And immediately there is a terror-struck silence. But you have to. You have to, because if you don't, then you're not a real liberal, are you? So this was happening in JNU. You would protest against Palestine, but you wouldn't protest against Tibet. There was no protest against China in JNU, ever. There was no examination of communism. What happened, under Mao, Frank Dicotter. I mentioned these books in this book, and also in JNU. There was never a debate on communism. And our communists, they never read Arthur Koestler, they never read the Black Book on Communism. Why not? So it is precisely this closure of the mind that I was protesting. And in a sense, I say this often, so, I wouldn't go to the extent of saying I'm ideology agnostic, but I care less and less about it. I care more and more about integrity. Integrity in public life, integrity in the classroom, and integrity in the family. I think these are the dharmic values, I think, that India should espouse, rather than being a culture of hypocrites and power worshippers, and I would say pusillanimous public intellectuals. I think we are out of time.
So I think what we'll do is we'll just have one quick more comment and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So you are absolutely right that, for example, intersectional left liberalism has a problem in calling out Islamism, for example. Just today in Oslo, 2 people were killed in a terror attack at a prominent gay bar. Because right now there's Pride Month that's happening of the LGBTQ community. And the suspect is of Iranian origin. and because they're supposed to be quote unquote allies in that ideology, the easier thing to is to blame quote unquote majoritarian quote unquote fascism than to actually blame what stares you in the face. But yes, communism is what I call the fourth Abrahamism, the god that failed. You mentioned Arthur Koestler. How do you see a way out? Because I see that without a focus on fraternity, as you mentioned, healing, it's not just liberty and equality, that's two dimensional. The third pillar of liberalism is fraternity. Without that, we don't have a viable political unit within which we converse with each other. And I think the failing of modern liberalism is this lack of focus on fraternity. And it's a very kind of technical focus on just liberty versus equality. How do you see that changing? And you've mentioned dharmic liberalism in the book, something a lot of us think about. How do you see India's contribution, not just to the Indian project, but to the global project going forward? I know it's a very broad-ended question, but then we'll open up to the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I just wrote an op-ed last week where I talked about these fractured societies, because when we were growing up, there was much greater social cohesion and conversation and conviviality. So this is what we need to restore. But now there's constantly a ratcheted up tension, whether it's between communities, because we are all stakeholders in the Indian Republic, Hindus, Muslims, everyone. But there's this constant identitarian tension and polarization, which is against fraternity. So in ideas which we can challenge each other, but there has to be the respect and friendliness, except those who don't believe, as Karl Popper said, democracies to survive must have a degree of intolerance to the intolerant. That's your Iran question, and Afzal Guru, Tere Qatil, Zinda Ham, Sharminda, and all. We have to be generally, intolerant of that kind of extreme intolerance, because that will destroy free societies are taken advantage of by precisely these elements, who will immediately say, my human rights, my freedom, but you don't believe in those human rights. You don't believe in those freedoms. So we have to expose that. And what you said about India, I think India has such a big role, because ultimately it's a consciousness revolution. My first book and my PhD was on mysticism in Indian English poetry. But this city is also a city of Ramakrishna, and there's a wonderful conversation between Ramakrishna and Bankim. So Bankim goes to meet Dakshineshwari, goes to meet the great Ramakrishna, where the Bhadraloks are going there, and they're so enamored of this so-called unlettered man who's giving them an alternative to modernity. And he asks, Sri Ramakrishna asks Bankim, why are you so bent out of shape? Bankim means bent. And as you know, it's a word for Sri Krishna, Ribhanga, Banke Bihari, for example. And he says that I'm bent because of the boots of the Britishers who kicked me, because he was a deputy magistrate. So here you have a face-off between, I think, tradition and modernity. And we need both. And I think that there are people who have understood this demand Vivekananda, for me, Gandhi, Tagore, and I think Sri Aurobindo, the greatest thinker, I feel, of the 20th century, one of the greatest worldwide. So I think they saw this challenge very clearly, that you can't turn your back to modernity, you can't go backwards to some golden age, you can't recreate a glorious golden age regardless of how wonderful it was. You have to move forward. But there's something from that past which is so valuable. And that something is what we may call this consciousness revolution. And Sri Aurobindo called it evolution. But ideal of human unity and the human cycle. So we have to move towards global governance. We can't deny rationality, but beyond reason there has to be wisdom, which the Dalai Lama also talks about, universal responsibility. So I think if there is a Bharat Bodh, if Bharat is a sort of beacon of light, it can only come because it has upheld a third way, an all-term modernity, I call it, And I think it has to be worked out, and different kinds of partnerships are required for it. Because eventually, if you look at how people regard AI and else, how they regard the structure of the universe, it's 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, like that. But consciousness is neither 0 nor 1, it's both, it's in between. So what I'm trying to say is maybe we'll have thinking machines, but the point is actually at the quantum level, we don't know where, the thing is, you can't predict where a particle is. It's not random, but it's uncertain. So what I'm trying to say is that almost at every moment, we have a choice of whether we want to be conscious or we want to be unconscious and mechanical. We can be matter or consciousness ourselves. And I think that India is the civilization which has constantly said we are consciousness, and matter itself is a species of consciousness, not the other way around. Consciousness is not epiphenomenal, and so forth. So I think that's a mystical enough note on which to...
So we'll open it up for questions. Okay, so can we have somebody, should we take a mic or?
Thank you for sharing your brilliance so lucidly. It's really a pleasure. I had a question. The world I see today is so specialized that people are running on parallel lines rather than converging. But I think concern for the environment is going to bring everyone together. What do you think about that?
Exactly, because our whole survival as a species which inhabits this beautiful planet is under threat. But there are the climate evangelists, who are also Abrahamic in a not so nice way, because they have climate salvationism and guilt, the original sin of your carbon footprint. So that's why I'm saying that it's only this kind of deep wisdom that can serve to create the consciousness that is required. And it's going to be a huge task and a huge ask, because we'll have to, as it were, reproduce less. We will have to be more thoughtful in our consumption. But for the first time in human history, we have enough food, enough clothes, enough of everything. So those challenges of the reptilian brain, as it were, those are met, but anxiety levels are so high, suicide levels are high. So all I'm saying is that the world of super specialization we have to go the other way. From analysis, we need to go towards synthesis, and we need integrative wisdom, which cuts across many disciplines, and is able to bring the environment in conversation with technology, in conversation with lifestyle changes, in conversation with the conservation of rivers and air that we breathe. So what I'm trying to say simply is that there's no single or simple solution, but a vast array of human expertise has to come together in unprecedented ways, which are not afforded by the competitive nation-state systems or even the global institutional setup that we have. WHO, it failed us in the pandemic, it gave wrong. So all these institutions, which were supposed to be for global governance, have to be rethought. And I think the internet, I think these virtual communities, I think the availability of information and the ability of people to get together and change in the virtual world, I think there are signs of hope, flashes of hope. But I don't know how it'll all work out. I don't think any single individual has an answer. But I think that we need this impulse, like an international volunteerism, where we really want to put our energies together to do good, to improve things, and without any top-down or authoritarian working out. There might be interesting ways in which, our collective Ichha Shakti, Gyan Shakti and Kriya Shakti, can work together to produce a change. But I mean, for me, the key is a consciousness revolution. Because the mentality has to be changed in the mind.
Okay, so if we have quick questions, then we have time for two more. First there.
So,
Let's go there. Then and then.
so quickly, sir, thank you, and heavily privileged I'm feeling right now from this little well of mine from which I've been actually trying to see the world. My first take quickly is, since we're celebrating or remembering in good or bad, right or wrong, the emergency, I have a quick take on it that the very fact that, elections were declared while emergency was still on by the lady and fully aware that she's going to lose, and that also being a humiliating defeat, which she... So the very fact that she declared the elections during emergency itself, I think, speaks of the fact that democracy prevailed, despite the tornado. It weathered the storms. So that is my first take on your whole preview. My second take is that I feel free speech, free thought, and a clear conscience is something which is emerging from all the issues that we've been talking about. Being a mother to two grown-ups, I can see the difference with which the boys now speak, and kind of take the roots of their value system and branch much more into a very free, vocal environment which they are, in their own.
So I think it's the question because you want to go there and then get the answers. Just the
Yeah,
question.
so that younger generation is which I would like you to tell us a little more, about how they can, kind of extend.
Okay, so the
from
message
home.
for the younger generation.
Yeah.
Quickly as I can, not as articulately and lucidly as you could, but the paradoxes are larger than ever before. You spoke about loneliness, and there's a ministry of loneliness now, I suppose, in China and other countries, and we're bursting at our seams in terms of population. We're so over-informed, and are we making our own choices? Or are we subconsciously copying the legitimate choice, which is we don't even know we are copying, we don't even know we are imitating. And on a lighter note, if you go into any supermarket today, you try to buy a tube of toothpaste, your mind boggles because there are 120 varieties. You haven't paid that much attention to your teeth, but there are 120 varieties of toothpaste. So I'm just saying that the essence seems to have taken a backseat over marketing, whether it's marketing of communism, marketing of toothpaste, marketing of anything. Pardon the boldness. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. That's why, in some ways, just truth telling won't do. You have to. Truth selling is also important. But how do you sell truth? Because the moment you start selling truth, you're using the same mechanisms of influencing, the same marketing. So, I mean, these are the big paradoxes. I mean, can you create algorithms to promote a counterculture? And it's not that these questions were not thought through, like Brave New World, 1984. People were thinking about totalitarianism, but now it's digital totalitarianism, right? And to me, it's only a critical and awakened mind that can resist this, right? And I think it requires a daily practice of awareness, of conscious living. And I have tremendous, in a way, faith in the capacity of human discrimination. I don't think any amount of, I mean, maybe I'm a die-hard, whatever, in that sense, humanist or whatever, because I think that, and this sort of segues into the answer for the young people also, because I don't think the schools and colleges are encouraging, openness and questioning, and I don't care so much about sort of free thought and free speech, but I care more about questioning, an attitude which is open and critical as well as respectful. It's not dismissive, So I don't see that a lot, frankly. I see that even in JNU, I think people are all tied up, in many ways. But talking about the emergency, yes, I think that Mrs. Indira Gandhi was misled into thinking that the country was behind her. She was in a, ivory tower, like the Lady of Shalott, let's say. You can only see mirror images of yourself. That happens with all very powerful people. But I do accept that she had a democratic impulse. And I'm not as anti-Nehruvian as many people are. He made a lot of mistakes, we can't deny it. But I don't think the pendulum should swing to the other side so much that we take the position live and let die, that only my ideology will flourish. And I call it China envy, where there's no distinction between party, state and civil society. It permeates everywhere. And that's dangerous, because where are the alternative voices? Who is going to question power, And you can't delegitimate anybody who raises a question, So, but I'm saying, to come back to your question, and the loneliness, over-informed, overpopulated, but isolated. And these are all our challenges. Like, you can look at the fertility rates in the well-off countries of the world and the well-off sections of society, really plummeting. So who will have that consciousness or intelligence to bring change? So I don't have the answers, but I'm saying that we have to take on this challenge of living consciously. You can't expect someone else to do it. So we have to do it. And I think the hope is that I don't think that individuals are so individuated. I think consciousness permeates, By that I mean, the moment you have an idea, it's magically and instantly available to all humanity, in a manner of speaking. Even though you may not know it and see it like that, it is a matrix. Consciousness is a matrix. And therefore, to have these ideas, or to live at a certain level, you automatically affect everything around you. That's what I think.
Thank you, Makarand, for an excellent conversation and for overcoming your reluctance. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
On behalf of the foundation, I take this opportunity to thank today's author, Dr. Paranjape. I'm so sorry, Dr. Paranjape, and the conversationalist, Mr. Madhusudan, on behalf for this insightful session. I also express my sincerest gratitude to our patron, Sri Cement Limited, Associate Taj Bengal, Media Partner Mike Kolkata, and the wonderful audience here for making this event. I now request Mr. Nicola Fasino to felicitate our author and Ms. Irina Fasino to felicitate the conversationalist with the memento of Bengal's Dogra.
One thing, we should face it this way. Okay. And this is, we're reading a book,
Oh yes, this is a lecture.
I like the
Et vous parlez un peu
pause.
français?
Thank you.
Non. Thank you.
Thank you so much.